What's going on, guys? My name is Matt, and for a while I've very badly needed a new data storage solution. See, up until this point I've done what a lot of content creators do, which is fill up my internal drives, then either delete files or move them to an assortment of external drives. This works okay, but it makes it hard to track down certain files, and there's no redundancy, which isn't great. Going for something like an off-the-shelf NAS can cost hundreds, if not thousands of dollars before you even begin to factor in the cost of drives. Hopping onto YouTube, you'll find people who claim to have built a high drive count system for only a few $1,000s, and then they proceed to pull out $10,000 worth of drives provided to them from a manufacturer. This is fine and all, but I wanted to see what I could put together for much cheaper. So say hello to my new 80 terabyte storage server that I put together all in for right around 1,500 bucks. It's got an 8-thread Xeon CPU, 16 gigs of RAM, 80 terabytes of raw capacity, SSD cache, and more. Now, just a disclaimer, I'm a huge server noob, so don't take this as a guide, and actually there is a bit of a glaring issue with the hardware selection in the system, which I'll talk about later in the video. So the idea for this server all started when I saw a craft computing video on a 1U 12 drive server that cost under 150 bucks. This seemed like what I was looking for, and I kept coming back to this video until I decided to track one of these down and purchase it. Going onto eBay, I found a number of these Chenbro NR12000 servers with various configurations. After some deliberation, I landed on purchasing this one for $120 with free shipping. This server had pretty much everything I needed besides RAM and drives. I ordered this one, and a week or so later a box landed on my doorstep. Opening it up, I found the surprisingly compact system suspended in a bunch of closed-cell foam. This made me super happy to see that it was so well packed. Pulling it out of the box, the only other thing I found was a power cable, and pulling it out of the foam, I was ready to open it up for the first time. Loosening this thumb screw right here allows the huge top panel to slide forward, then be pulled off. Inside, you can see around 40% of the space is taken up by the server components, and then the whole other section contains mounting spots and cables for up to 12 3.5-inch drives. In terms of core specs, the CPU this came with is the Intel Xeon E3-1230V2. This is a 4-core 8-thread CPU running on the Ivy Bridge architecture. The E3-1230V2 has a base and boost clock of 3.3 and 3.7 GHz respectively. This is a bit overkill for my current use case, but I may be able to take advantage of it in the future for stuff like virtual machines. This CPU is being cooled by an all-copper passive heatsink. This little guy is surprisingly heavy for how small it is. With no fans on the heatsink itself, it means it gets all of its airflow from the 40mm fans placed towards the middle of the case. There's also this thin plastic shroud that ensures 3 of the fans blow directly onto the heatsink and RAM. The motherboard this system uses is on the LGA 1155 platform and is made by a company called Tyan. It has 4 RAM slots, a bunch of PCIe slots which aren't that important because of the system's 1U form factor, but would be good in a more standard thickness case. The I/O on this board is 4 USB 2 ports, dual gigabit Ethernet ports, an IPMI port, VGA, serial, and a UID LED button. This isn't great for a normal system, but for a server, this selection of ports is fine. The real feature of this board that makes it perfect for this use case is the 14 built-in SATA ports. This allows all 12 of the main drives to plug directly into the motherboard, leaving 2 more open for extra cache drives or even redundant OS drives depending on the configuration you go with. Powering the system is a 400 watt, 80 plus gold rated Flex ATX power supply. This unit is purpose built for a server like this with tons of SATA power connectors. One downside of this server is that it doesn't have redundant PSUs, but that's fine for me. Now there are 13 total SATA power and data cables pre-run to each of the 12 drive slots and one to a 2.5-inch slot for an OS drive. What's really nice is they're all labeled, which is amazing for troubleshooting and finding a problem drive within the array. This labeling can 100% be done in any system, but having it pre-done saves a ton of time, and for a noob like me it's extremely helpful in keeping a project like this from being overwhelming. All these parts are in the 1U enclosure, which is pretty compact considering how much hardware can fit in it. With the server picked out and received, I could start figuring out and ordering other parts. For a system like this, you ideally want ECC memory, but unfortunately this doesn't support registered ECC memory. Because of this, I hopped onto eBay looking for a RAM kit that would fit my needs and budget. What I ended up getting was 4GB sticks of crucial unbuffered DDR3 RAM running at 1066 MHz. These 4 sticks cost a total of around $43, which is an okay deal for unbuffered ECC RAM. 16GB is an adequate amount, especially for the configuration I ended up with, and luckily they installed and worked flawlessly in this system. With RAM picked out, all that was left to do was purchase drives. I did a bunch of thinking and planning to get drives and was waiting for good deals on higher capacity drives, but with the looming possibility of a drive shortage due to Chia mining, I eventually decided to pull the trigger on 10 8TB external Seagate drives. See, normally you would buy standalone drives, but believe it or not, it's cheaper to buy the external versions and take the drives out of them. This practice is known as shucking and is very common within the data hoarding community. Again, I originally wanted to get something like 12 or 14TB drives, but I couldn't find a good enough deal, so again purchased 10 8TB drives at an average of $125 each. This totals to $1,250 spent on mechanical drives for the array. I also purchased a 500GB SATA SSD to be used as a cache drive. This is the crucial MX500, which is a good quality SATA drive, and I'll be explaining more details about using it as a cache drive later in the video. With all the drives in hand, I could begin shucking. Opening up the packaging on one of these drives, I found the drive itself, some paperwork, a USB cable, and a power cable. I started by taking each of the drives out of their packaging and plugging them in to ensure they powered on and reported normal functionality. Once this was done, I could begin opening them up. One thing to note is that taking the drives out of the casings does void the warranty, but these drives are much cheaper than their standalone counterparts, so you have to decide for yourself if the cost saving is worth it or not. To get into these enclosures, you need to start by wedging something super thin like a razor blade into the seam like this. Then you can wedge something slightly bigger into place and begin to pry up to release the clips. It's very difficult and may be impossible for a normal consumer to open these without breaking any of the clips, and I definitely left most of these with numerous broken ones. With the top popped off, I could then do a little prying to get the drive out, then I could pull off these rubber shock mounts and unscrew these metal pegs. With that done, I could unpeel this metal foil, flip it over, remove this screw, then remove this board. This little board is just a SATA to USB adapter, and I may save these to use in the future. With one drive done, I then had to repeat the process 9 more times, and here's a little time lapse of me doing it. So with all the drives out, I was ready to mount them. Now when shucking external drives, you never really know what you're gonna get. Most of the larger capacity Seagate external drives use Ironwolf NAS or even Exos drives, which are super high quality, and one of the reasons I originally wanted to go for the larger capacity ones. Inside of these 8TB external drives were 10 Seagate Barracuda Compute ones. These are model number ST8000DM004. And I got these for about $30 less per drive compared to buying these standalone drives, meaning I saved around $300 buying them as external ones. This is when I came to a very important realization. These are actually SMR drives. SMR, or shingled magnetic recording, is an inferior and outdated design which is very unideal for certain use cases, but with them all shucked, I had to proceed with the build, and in the end it worked out fine for my use case, which I'll explain in a minute. To mount these, I needed a few things that didn't come with the case. I needed these little rubber gaskets that I got off of Amazon, and some 6/32 bolts that I got from my local hardware store. The gasket slips over the bolt, then one is secured into each of the 4 bottom mounting holes on the drive. I installed 4 into each, meaning 40 bolts and 40 gaskets total. The first one was brought to mount number 1. The SATA data and power was plugged in, it was lowered down, and then slid back to secure all 4 gaskets into place. With the first one done, all I had to do was install the other 9 drives one at a time into mounts 2 through 10. With that completed, the last component I had to install was the cache drive, which is in mount 11 and currently not secured, but I will probably mount it with some double-sided tape in the future. With that done, I needed to decide what kind of OS and file system I'd be using with this. I originally debated between TrueNAS Core with a ZFS RAID Z2 file system, but because of the way ZFS stripes data across the array, my research shows that SMR drives would not be good to use in that kind of setup. This made the choice to use Unraid much easier. Now, Unraid is paid software, but it's ridiculously easy to set up and gives a good alternative to RAID or ZFS, which are the more common options for a file server like this. See, instead of data striped across the array of drives, each file is only stored on one drive, and you set up parity drives for data protection. This means accessing files only requires one drive to spin up, making for a quieter, more power efficient, and less drive stress intensive setup. While this does all sound great, it comes with the caveat of having much less performance when compared to a RAID 6 or ZFS RAID Z2 setup. With normal write speeds of around 30 megabytes per second, it can be painfully slow to transfer files. With that being said, that's where the cache drive comes in. When transferring files to the server, they first go to the cache drive at a faster rate, then at a later time, say in the middle of the night, you can use a mover script to transfer them automatically to the array. For me, this is great because it means a ton of archival storage that should be reliable and low maintenance, but the slow speed means doing stuff like editing directly off the array isn't possible, which again is fine with me. Setting up Unraid is very simple, and I actually followed a guide by Juan M. Tech, who did a great job of explaining the basics of how to set it up. I'll go over the process briefly in this video, but we'll link the tutorial in the description. Unraid actually is installed on a USB drive, and then the OS is loaded into RAM anytime the system boots up. All you really need is a USB drive that has a few gigabytes of capacity. I actually ended up using this 64 gigabyte drive because it's the most compact one I own, and may eventually clone it to a smaller capacity one. It's important that it's physically compact because it will be permanently sticking out of the back of the server, and the lower profile the better. So to set the USB up, I just downloaded the Unraid USB flash creator, opened it up, named the server, then installed it to the flash drive, and this whole process took like 2 minutes. I then plugged it into the server and booted into the BIOS. The only monitor I have with VGA is this dying one, so please excuse the poor picture quality. I set the boot priority to the USB drive, then saved changes and exited. It booted to this window, then automatically loaded in the Unraid OS. It did an initial setup, then provided an IP address to access the server remotely from any web browser connected to the same network. I then went into my browser and typed in the IP address that was provided and was brought to this page. The Unraid version I need will be $90, but I just started out with the trial to make sure I liked it. I then proceeded to assign the first 2 drives as parity drives, the other 8 as part of the array, and the SSD as cache. I then had to build the array and configure the parity drives, which for 8TB parity drives took around 16 hours. This isn't ideal, but is pretty normal for the size of this drive. Then I formatted the drives in the array, then set up a root password, created a share folder that I will access over the network, created myself a user account that can read and write to the share, and finally mapped the network share to my file explorer. Once that was done, I had access to the full array. Once parity drives were taken into account along with the overstatement of size by drive manufacturers, I was left with around 58 terabytes of capacity. This amount of storage should last me a minimum of 2 years and likely at least 3. Getting back to the drives used, SMR drives have their major downside in rewrite performance from my understanding, so if you're constantly adding and deleting files to the server, it's definitely not ideal, but anything I put on the server will more than likely never be deleted, which means this problem shouldn't affect me. Again, if you're doing a project like this, try and avoid SMR drives and go for CMR instead. All in all, for around $1,500 in hardware, this 80TB storage server is pretty sweet in my opinion, but I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below. I'm a server noob like I said before, so if there's another way you think I should configure this, or certain plugins or features I should enable, let me know. All the parts and resources mentioned in the video will be linked in the description. If you guys have any questions, I'll try and answer as many as I can. So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.